People learn their history around commemorations. But in a deeply divided society, commemoration is always seen as potentially dangerous.
It's a time, the first time, when the state and the media commemorate 1916 without fear or favour.
I think the whole country actually had an uplift of spirit and morale. It was a state celebration. There was no talk of shame for 1916. There was great pride in the men of the brave deeds and the self-sacrifice.
And the reason it had such impact was that it was communicated and experienced through the medium of television. The 1960s, a time of space exploration, civil rights and world economic boom. At home, a new Ireland was emerging and the country looked towards a vibrant and optimistic future. Brand new factories appeared, along with Ireland's first shopping centre in Stillorgan, County Dublin. And new social housing in Ballymun named its 7 apartment blocks after the signatories of the 1916 Rising.
We had, in 1963, the visit of John F. Kennedy to Ireland, and there was that sense of confidence that if this man could become president of the most prosperous and iconic country in the world, that we too, as Catholics, perhaps, had something to aspire to.
I remember it as a time of great hope. There was an openness now with Lemass to Britain, to Northern Ireland, and talk about us joining the European Union.
The economy is growing, emigration is falling, and there was a general mood of optimism that things had turned around.
It was also a new era in Irish broadcasting, as the fledgling new television station was launched only a few years earlier. By now, 55% of the population had televisions, with many families buying or renting new sets in time for the Jubilee celebrations launched by the then Taoiseach, Sean Lemass.
The 1916 Commemoration Committee were conscious of the general desire amongst the Irish people that their scope and dignity should further enhance the status of our nation in the eyes of the world, emphasising both our pride in the past and confidence in the future.
Lemass constantly pushed this image of a modern Ireland at home and abroad, so the Jubilee marked an opportunity to look forward as well as back. There were marches, pageants, unveiling of statues, grand openings, and lots of readings of the proclamation. There was also special issuing of commemorative stamps and a coin. This is it. It was made of solid silver, and it had Pádraic Pearse on one side and Cuchulainn on the other. This one belonged to my mother, actually, and my goodness, she treasured this coin right throughout her life. One of the most memorable occasions of 1966, though, was the grand display which happened here on O'Connell Street and which kick-started the Golden Jubilee.
It was probably the greatest gathering of peoples that had ever happened in the history of Dublin on that occasion. A fantastic military display and a great celebration for the men of 16.
Well, we had the coming together of the anti-partitionists and the pro-partitionists, the first time that the new state came together in a very formal fashion.
There's a sense of let's pay tribute to them, let's say thank you to them, let's say, in a sense, goodbye to them.
2 1916 men were key figures at all the events. Lemass might have driven the whole extravaganza, but it was De Valera, the last remaining commandant from 1916, who was hero of the hour.
The man who had been condemned to death, but because of his citizenship of America, hadn't been executed. So he emerged very much as the big man in '66.
He was like some kind of symbolic figure, you know, almost like a figurehead. And in that sense, that kind of symbolic element seemed to be stronger than the human element. So there was a ceremonial aspect to his being there and people's recognition of him as a ceremonial figure.
Though the concept of archiving film was a remote one back then, Television Éireann did have the forward vision to capture all those live events using colour tape.
And the exciting thing I found is that although the station was still in black and white, we were able to load colour film into our film cameras. And in other words, we went colour, and we felt rather chuffed about that.
I can remember that I went down about 3 or 4 days beforehand to do a recce. I think we had 2 or 3 cameras on it. We had one with high shot looking down across the whole thing, and then another camera down towards O'Connell Bridge, and then I was on the one in front of the GPO.
So you had a bird's eye view?
A bird's eye view, yes.
Marching past the cameras on that day were young cadets from the 39th class.
So this is where you would have marched as cadets on Easter Sunday, 1966.
That's right, and just about here we would have received the order, Jarky Folk Clay, or eyes left. Everybody turned their eyes and head to the left in salute to the President, and the front left-hand man remained looking straight ahead to ensure that the cohesion of the column wasn't lost.
And the looking to the left was a mark of respect, wasn't it, to the people on the reviewing stand?
Well, at the same time as Captain Duffy gave us the order, Jarky Folk Clay, I draped the flag, which was in homage to the men and women of 1916 who were gathered in over 600 there on the platform. And at the same time as we went by the GPO, which was all choreographed perfectly, the Air Corps flew overhead in 4 Vampire jets. So momentarily, the noise of the jet engines drowned out the marching bands.
Just under the clock there, under the columns, were the President, President De Valera, and the veterans. That must have been very moving.
It really was. I was amazed to see so many people alive and looking relatively healthy. And they all stood there very, very proudly. And they joined in the President in taking the salute. And we felt honoured to be doing what we were doing. And very, very proud.
Frank, can you imagine the thoughts that were in the veterans' heads on that Easter Sunday morning, 1966, remembering back to the Easter they spent here in 1916?
Well, it was inconceivable to us as young people as to what they thought. But when you think about it objectively today, they were in the risen Phoenix, which was the GPO, which was destroyed by fire and warfare in 1916. And there they were on a platform with the head of the government, the Taoiseach, and the whole cabinet. And they were there being admired and saluted by their successors in the army, which was us and the other members of the army at the time. So I'm thinking all that now, and I can only say I'm as proud as be damned that I was there in the middle of it, and I'm delighted, as Mick said earlier, to be here to see it today as well.
There were also big celebrations around the country, including Cork, Limerick, Galway, Tralee and Monaghan. Lemass was determined these events wouldn't be used for constituency purposes, so Jack Lynch was sent to Dundalk, Frank Aiken to Cork, and Charles Haughey made a guest appearance in Cloughjordan.
And this is Castle Hill going down towards the Abbey Square in Enniscorthy. 1966. And these are the men with their medals, their hats on and their medals. And all the school children would either be ahead of them. But I do remember this idea of that the men who fought were actually walking through the town.
Colm Tóibín's grandfather rose up in Enniscorthy in 1916 and was interned in Frongach in Wales. Unfortunately, he didn't live to be honoured in his hometown in 1966.
It was a big privilege to be in Enniscorthy and to be someone whose grandfather had fought in the rebellion and to walk through the town feeling that, you know, this matters. Certainly that, and feeling that other towns didn't have this. Other towns, I won't mention, who didn't rise up in 1916, they didn't have what we had in Enniscorthy, which was special. You know, later when people asked about blood sacrifice or the wisdom of having a rebellion or the idea of a mandate or who exactly told these people they could do this, there was certainly none of that discussed in any way in 1966. Certainly for this 11-year-old, this was an entirely heroic event led by people whose names were heroic.
In Carlow, a young Olivia O'Leary was in boarding school studying for her Leaving Cert.
We did have a ceremony to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and it consisted of a group of verse speakers who were from my year standing on the stage, reading the proclamation very carefully, coached by the elocution teacher, and in the background was me playing the harp, and I was playing The Children of Lear. And a man who was a veteran of 1916 got up to make a speech, and it was a rousing speech. And then he lashed in to the first government of the Free State and those traitors who turned on the freedom fighters. And at this stage, me coming from a Fine Gael pro-treaty background, I was standing there beside the headmistress, and I turned to her and I said, this man is just saying that the properly elected government of the Irish people were traitors. And she said, shh, he was the only one we could get.
Meanwhile, here in Northern Ireland, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme was being commemorated. Northern nationalists, on the other hand, felt aggrieved that they hadn't been included in any official 1916 events, only those organised by Republican groups. And then Prime Minister Terence O'Neill was under pressure from unionists that he even let these go ahead.
1916 was not fought on behalf of a 26-county state. And if the Republic of Ireland, the Irish state, is the successful beneficiary of 1916, what's this saying to Northern nationalists? That they, as part of the Irish nation, which is how they see themselves, are perpetually excluded?
The main sense in Northern Ireland is that that crowd down there in Dublin are celebrating how well they've done. Look at poor us up here. They are on building good relationships with Terence O'Neill. They are ignoring us. And O'Neill's doing nothing for us. Dublin's doing nothing for us. Nobody is doing anything for us. So it does galvanise Northern nationalism.
Well, the big parade in West Belfast in April, over 70,000 people come out to watch it. There are hundreds of bands, there are Irish dancing schools. It goes on for about 2 miles. People gather at Beachmount. It's an enormous public event in the life of West Belfast. It is their statement that they wish to be considered as part of the commemorative programme. On the margins, you have this figure of Ian Paisley, and he uses the promise of the nationalist Republican commemorations as a platform which he can oppose. And that gives him his first substantial, large public audience in Northern Ireland.
No surrender!
Ireland's public broadcaster stretched its resources to the limits, producing more than 50 hours of programming for Easter week.
The RTV guide for Easter week will be on sale tomorrow at your local newsagent.
The most ambitious project to date, which was an incredible feat for such a young television station, was an 8-part docudrama series reenacting the events of Easter week.
Hugh Leonard, who was asked to script the series, once said that it was a bit like The Rising itself, that it was very gallant and perhaps doomed. But he eventually realised that it was a hugely optimistic undertaking.
In studio, Ray McAnally played the role of TV anchor, gathering reports on the ground as the events of the week unfolded.
It didn't try really to over-glorify what happened. It showed the amateurishness of the attempt on the nationalist side of the rebellion.
The citizen army are assembled, although at nothing like full strength.
It showed the sort of chaos and the slaughter. So they didn't try to clean it up.
Be off, I tell you.
Well, Pádraig, here we are. An empty, vast Studio One was transformed into the GPO.
this was the GPO, and the set was fantastic. Alpha O'Reilly designed the set, and he got it inch perfect. And also there's great credit due to the craftsmen and RT.
There was a whirlwind of energy in the place. So we were sweeping up inside the counters at the GPO, clearing off the things, setting up our bags, you know, sacks that had all this stuff, the bandages, food. And then, looking through the rails, you could hear the glass being smashed as the butts of the rifles went through.
Later in the afternoon, Commandant Pearce walked out of the GPO and read a proclamation.
We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms.
If RTE were recreating the events of 1916 through the prism of television, for many, that would have been the actual factual account. And there was no room for manoeuvre.
And by the readiness of its children to sacrifice themselves for the common good, prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it is called. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Government, Thomas J. Clarke, Sean McDermott, Thomas McDonough, P.H. Pearce, Eamon Kent, James Connolly, Joseph Plunkett.
Above all, I remember the fire in the GPO and it was in here.
The fires which are consuming buildings in Sackville Street must sooner or later drive the rebels into the open. When that happens, I can assure them of a hot reception.
They got the Dublin Gas Company in to lay a collar of fires around the GPO. Around the studio, I will say, around the GPO, yeah.
You had all the gunfire and the blasting, and I remember that very clearly. The dash across from the Henry Street exit from the GPO down to the laneway, and, you know, it was just noise and all kinds of things going on.
Everything looked so real. But there was also 3 or 4 units of the Dublin Fire Brigade standing by outside for fear RT was going to go up and smoke. There was no rehearsals of that particular segment. They had to take it in one.
Wow.
And you'll see it's a part of the insurrection that's really very moving. The GPO going up in flames and Pearce in the middle of it. My very good friend played the part of Pearce, Owen O'Sullivan. And I think he was a fantastic actor. They were very moving parts.
Was it meaningful for you to be actually playing the part that you played, that of Sean McDermott?
Very much so, because I think it was the part I understood most. I had read about him being an officer of the IRB. To me, he came across as kind of the calming effect on the others, although after 4 or 5 days, they knew the game was up.
Can you imagine the thoughts that must have been going through her head?
Oh, yes, but she was so stoic. So, you know, and the girl who played her, Sheila Cullen, had that kind of strength in her too. She says, well, she knew her. She was taking her, as she did, going through the lines later on. Their lives were in danger all the time.
Because this piece is based on Nurse O'Farrell's.
Oh, from the
notes.
military archives, is a step-by-step account of what was happening and all that happened to them.
In the meantime, the leaders waited.
Do you remember this?
Sort of.
Are they going to shoot her? Oh, Miss O'Farrell.
Oh, no, not at all.
Miss Grennan.
Now, you mustn't be crying for your friend. They won't shoot her.
They were lifetime friends and remained afterwards forever.
Don't worry.
They won't shoot her.
In many homes around the country, watching this became a communal experience. Joining Colm Tobin's family in Wexford was a neighbour, Marion Stokes, one of the women who raised the flag over the Athenaeum in Enniscorthy in 1916.
But having Marion Stokes there certainly made a difference in that she had been there. She had been in the rebellion. The thing that really began to matter and build up tension in our house were the families visiting those who were to be executed. On the last night, when the Connolly episode was shown, and when he's lying bravely in bed, and his wife and his daughter are there with him, and the wife is particularly, holding on to him and crying.
Do you want to unman me?
Your beautiful life, James, your beautiful life.
Hasn't it been a good life? And isn't this a good end? Nora, there's nothing to cry for.
I won't cry, Papa.
You're a good girl, Nora.
My mother, who was not given to emotion, I had never seen her cry before, ever. She suddenly stood up and ran screaming, crying out of the room, and people had to run out after her. God only knows, what Marion Stokes was doing. I think, Marion was calmly just watching the television. But for us, this was immense drama, to have something on television affecting the family in this way.
Yes, now somebody is being brought out of the building, someone on a stretcher. Yes, the man on the stretcher is James Connolly. For a moment, we saw his face distinctly.
It was high drama in the house to get her back into the room, and she said, oh, of all the things the British did, shooting James Connolly was the one. And, it would go on for days, or people would call to the house, did you see, and then she'd tell the whole story of what. So it really had that sort of enormous impact.
I went down on my bare knees by my bedside one night and promised God that I should devote my life to an effort to free my country.
There was a sense of consensus that we were a nation that had a proud revolutionary past, and that not just Irish people respected that, but remember that insurrection was sold both to BBC and to ABC in Australia. It travelled far and wide to Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, and there was a huge sense that the Irish were the first to decolonise themselves, and they did it through the most improbable means, a revolution in Easter 1916.
I will call to you in my heart at the last moment.
The site of the Garden of Remembrance in Dublin is where the Irish Volunteers were founded, and also where several leaders of the Rising were held before being taken to Kilmainham Jail. It was opened on Easter Monday in 1966 and dedicated to all those who gave their lives in the cause of Irish freedom. Present were dignitaries and veterans, but receiving special attention on the day were the young Army cadets of the 39th class.
I haven't been on this wall for 50 years. There were 24 of us selected, and it was a very important day for us. I remember our colonel, he had us standing on a roof in the Curragh, a flat roof which was snow-covered, and we were working the time of our drill using a metronome. We thought it was crazy at the time, but having spent about 2 hours on the wall here, we felt the rehearsal was probably worthwhile.
It was justified, yeah.
Frank, you as cadets really did have a wonderful vista at this height. Best seats in the house, really, because the Children of Lear weren't even there in 1966.
On the day in question, we were standing on what was then a very narrow ledge of about only 2.5 feet wide.
Because this wasn't here.
This platform wasn't behind us, so there was just a fall back to the road of clay, so at least if we fell backwards, we could roll down a hill.
You wouldn't want to suffer from vertigo.
No, absolutely so. Thank God that didn't happen.
There was a bitter east wind blowing into our faces, and to appear to be absolutely erect, we were trying to lean slightly forward. Then we realised the wind stopped, we were in trouble. Fortunately, it didn't stop, and I remember feeling guilty that I felt cold, and there were old men down there, one of whom was on a stretcher, who I subsequently discovered was a Mr. Joe Gahan, who'd been in the garrison in the GPO. And during a salute, he came to attention on the stretcher and gave a lovely crisp salute that any cadet would have been proud of.
Many veterans of 1916 were interviewed for the prize-winning documentary series of 1966 on behalf of the Provisional Government. These were 7 programmes profiling the signatories of the Rising and made by producer Andreas O'Gallagher.
He insisted in going to the homes where the sons and daughters of these people lived. So it was family. This was history. And we were privileged to be there to do the recording of this, you know.
And it was a great pleasure to meet some of the people who were involved and, you know, question them about their recollections at the time. These people who had been painted as saints and heroes, here they were, they had a human side to them. They had their weaknesses as well as their virtues.
The way I see the presentation of the figures in it was very much huge emphasis on the poets, the cultural background.
There was a whole sense of them not as soldiers, not as strutting figures, strutting about with guns, sort of naturally.
I think maybe partly due to the profiles that were done on television. Before '66, I would have said Pearse was the big man, and now in '66, and from then on, Connolly seems to appear in a bigger and bigger role in the whole 1916 thing.
Connolly is outed, in a sense, in '66 as a socialist in a way that he might not have been before.
Also in the series, many first-hand accounts were collected about events during that fateful week, including stories from inside the GPO.
When the meal was nearly over, the post office was, of course, completely on fire at the time. It hadn't come quite down to our room, but it was all around us, though. I asked Tom Clark, I said, what would you do if we won? Well, he said, we won't win this time. And I said, if we won, what would you do? Well, he said, I hope you won't be disappointed. But I still persisted, and I said to him, but what would you do if we did win? He said, I'd get a small cottage with a big wall round it, and I'd grow flowers.
He loved the garden, and every minute. In fact, in the summertime, most of our meals were out in the garden.
Kathleen Clark was one of the people that impressed me most. I remember asking her what she thought of Pearse. Now, she didn't think too much of Pearse. She thought he had taken over from Tom Clark, that Clark was really, should be the president. And a lot of the others all looked up to Clark in a big way like that, although he kept very much in the background. She said Pearse would come into her shop and he'd say, is Mr. Clark around, please, could I have a word with him? And she said, he wouldn't look at you straight in the face, he'd be looking at everything else in the shop.
He was a difficult character to understand. The things I might think of him mightn't be fair. He could write beautifully, you see. He did write beautifully. But when he came to talking with you, he was, you'd hardly ever hear him talking.
Many people in the documentary series also spoke about Scoleana, or St Enda's, a former all-Irish secondary school in Rathfarnham founded by Padraig Pearse. In 1966, a poem about Pearse won a prize in a countrywide schools competition which marked the Golden Jubilee.
Dort foster Scoleana, Padraig Mac Pearse. Dolas bíngurt wimme a queene. A maca skis for dúch fevrón. Tuishach gasta, triem mar calama. A Fádric Chrístig, tui beoga foi.
You must be very proud to be reciting it here in this room, Pearse's study in his old school.
It actually brings the dawn to light. Reading it in this room is totally different to reading it at home yesterday.
And what was it like when you met De Valera?
Going to Áras an Uachtaráin was a life apart from boarding school at the time in Cloistide, Danganechouch. Some people look at a camera when their picture is taken, but I never lifted my eyes off Dev. And the footage shows that today. You would know that he had impaired vision. And when he was writing the autograph, the paper was tilted sideways so that he wouldn't run off paper with his signature. And this was Eamon de Valera's autograph.
My goodness, I'm sure you treasure that, do you?
I really treasure that.
Were you always fascinated by Padraig Mac Pearse? What made you write that poem about him?
I grew up at home, and the signatories of 1916, there was a picture on the wall at home in the living room. And we went every day and we read those names. It was like saying the rosary to us. But Padraig MacPiarish, I was always attracted to Padraig. He loved Irish. He absolutely loved Irish, and so did I.
Feelings about the Irish language ran so high in 1966 that it became the #1 protest movement in the country.
There was a certain degree that the way to be true to the spirit of Pearse is to speak the language, you know, and that certainly happened.
Anish vocally Ashti Berla, Gilbert McAleem.
It was his father who gave.
It was also an education decade, with free secondary school education being introduced for the first time later that year. Television, playing its own part, devised the series of 4 dramas around 1916 for children. They were written by Kerry author Brian McMahon.
I said, well, where were you in 1916? And he said, I was here in Listowel. And I remember a train coming from Dublin and people getting off the train and saying there was an insurrection happening, and I didn't know what the word meant. So I said, that's a story to start with. So that's the way it began.
With my own eyes, I saw the Lancers charge. I saw the horses kicking and dying on the streets.
You must be dreaming, man.
I'm not dreaming.
Sure, we've had no word of it here.
What I'm telling you is true. The rebellion is on.
And this is the same little chap watching out so that nobody is going to be seeing him tearing the British recruiting poster off the wall that says, rally round the flag, boys.
The nationalist message was very strong in these dramas, particularly when they were aimed at children.
I suppose that Brian was absolutely replicating what he remembered himself. And I don't remember that anybody questioned that. We simply were in the mode of being reverential.
Now, this is from the bicycle man, Farron Rutter, the Irish teacher coming into the school.
I was looking out the schoolhouse window, and that was the day that I first saw Far a rocket. He left his bicycle at the school gate.
Brian McMahon had very distinct and very clear memories of the bicycle man coming round the schools and asking the teachers could he give a little lesson in Irish, which he would do apparently in a very amusing way so that they would enjoy taking it on board.
Come board, Exno Veronishke.
It's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it, from 1916, that there were these Irish language teachers travelling around to the classrooms where Irish was forbidden to be taught.
Yes, and of course they were unpaid, and they did it off their own bat, so to speak, and they mightn't have got a welcome in every school.
I was fascinated to see written on the blackboard, "We are happy English children."
That was a mantra that the children learned, and I was surprised by it, and I asked some elderly relatives of mine, what is this, we are happy English? Oh yes, they said, we all learned that. We are happy English children.
You're welcome. Thank you. Come, pardon a bit. Will Cadigam have I your permission? Oh, yes, yes, yes. Thank you.
Kilmainham Jail was opened to the public as a history museum in 1966, having been closed as a jail for more than 40 years. This was all thanks to the Volunteer Restoration Committee, who raised funds and renovated the building in order to have it ready for the Jubilee. Taoiseach Sean Lemass and President De Valera arrived on Easter Sunday for the formal opening.
This is the old Rolls Royce that they still have and that can roll out for very important state occasions.
Kilmainham is thronged.
Yeah.
Thronged.
Yeah.
They're everywhere, look.
So he's going back to the yard. But the significant thing here, I think, is that he doesn't speak. He knows very well that just being filmed and being there will mean much more than any set of cliches he could utter about what it means.
But this is where his comrades
but
were
it is
shot.
significant. There's no microphone. There's no speech. That he understands a great deal about what power is. Power emerges from silence.
And respect.
Yeah. I think this must mean much more to him. You know, the idea of going back into your cell. And it's a great inscrutability about De Valera, isn't there?
Many of De Valera's colleagues spent their last moments in neighbouring cells. Min Ryan recalls visiting Sean McDermott with her sister just before his execution.
It was a small cell. We sat down on this bed. He sat between the two of us. We talked about everything. We kept off the evil moment of asking him anything about what was going to happen. But we talked about the things that had happened during the week and about people that were in it and people that weren't in it, and which he had a good laugh about some of them. We stood up promptly when the priest arrived and felt a great jerk, I'm sure, all of us. And all said goodbye. I was the last to say goodbye to him. And he kissed me and said, we never thought that it would end like this. That's all, that this would be the end, yes, that's all he said.
Of course, the one that I think almost everybody remembers is the one where Nora Connolly O'Brien spoke about her father. I don't think anybody will ever forget. And I'm nearly choked to speak about it. When she and her mother went on the night before he was to be executed. Sorry. And he said, you're to be brave, and you're to be, you know, don't break down, Lily, don't break down. And she said, oh, but your life, James, your beautiful life. You know, that was such a frightful thing and so affecting. I think everybody who saw it couldn't but be moved.
And we were there, talked about little things. He was trying to plan our life for after he was gone, and told us time was up and we'd have to go. He was to be shot at dawn, you see. So Mum, we couldn't get Mum away from the bed. The nurse had to come finally and help her away. And I went to the door, and then I went back to him. That was the last I saw him.
James Connolly.
Henrietta Street in Dublin. Streets like this were the backdrop to the Rising. Amidst the gunfire, the mayhem and the curfews, ordinary Dubliners in their tenements had to get on with their everyday lives. And it was these Dubliners who became the focus of Sean O'Casey's play The Plough and the Stars in 1926.
This wasn't quite in keeping with the image of modern Ireland that Lemass was trying to promote in '66, but Television was happy to go along with Lelia Doolan's suggestion of adapting this landmark play for television.
The fact is that Henrietta Street is a film set. You have the great entrance, which I think has been used many times since then, as a symbol of British imperialism up at the top. And as a setting, it really needed very little doing to it, because there were very few lampposts. One could shoot in between them. So kids would run around the street, and of course, sometimes if we could dress them up properly, they'd be in the actual shot.
Sean O'Casey, in his play, challenged the idealistic thinking behind the Rising and questioned whether this was the right war for people in a poverty-stricken city.
The whole idea of social justice, which was one of the elements that somehow got forgotten in the memories of 1916. You know, what was actually happening to people who were right in the centre of the city, where these idealistic middle-class artists were engaged in a drama, a very important one, you know, there's no question about that. And in fact, it's Uncle Peter who talks about, and Genital Pearse came out onto the middle of the O'Connell Street and read out the proclamation. You know, so you have a sense that there was everything there. There was the idealism of the young men who were engaged, and there was the reality of the life that people had to undertake day by day in those tenements.
And we see General Pearse and his staff, and he's standing in the middle of the street reading the proclamation.
What proclamation?
Declaring an Irish Republic.
God.
Yes, and the people living on the quays are to crawl on their bellies to mass with the bullets that was thrown around from Boland's mills.
Let there be God. What's going to be the end of his tale?
He wasn't just a playwright, he was also a music hall artist and a musician and a man who believed in song. I mean, I suppose the fight between Bessie Burgess and May Cluskey, Mrs. Gogan, Ginny Gogan, in the bar is, you know, it's a kind of a choreographed piece of dance, really, and musical dance. It's kind of opera.
Come on now, me loyal lassie, dying of grief for poor little Catholic Belgium. Oh, when Jenny Gogan's done with you, you'll have a little leisure lying down to pray for your king and queen. Oh, take Betty boy, listen outside the conscience eat you and show you to the devil. Get out, get it. Call round for the corner and you bet to the hall. Smack them along with
Not far from Henrietta Street is O'Connell Street, known then as Sackville Street, and considered one of the finest thoroughfares in Europe. For more than 150 years, Horatio Nelson enjoyed the best views of Dublin, standing in the exact same spot as the Spire today.
So who is that man up there, they say, some of them. Some will say, you see, and well, I say it's Lord Nelson. Yeah. Well, how is he here? Yeah. But he's not an Irishman. Quite so. Well, I'd explain to them that this pillar was built in 1808.
Nelson was particularly controversial, I think, because of the scale of the monument. You know, it dominated the main street, and it was beside a symbol of Irish nationalism, which is the GPO, a kind of accidental symbol of Irish nationalism. The middle ground, the compromise view was, why don't we keep the pillar? We put someone else up there. And he had some remarkable proposals. John F. Kennedy, Patrick Pearse, St. Patrick, the Virgin Mary. These were all proposed at different times for the top of the pillar. But it was a political football, and it had been a political football for a long, long time.
And March 1966, a Sunday night, I think it was, and everybody woke up on Monday morning to this headline.
1:30 in the morning, yeah, and the remarkable thing about it is it steals the thunder of the state completely. It's blamed on the IRA. In reality, the IRA had nothing to do with it. They weren't aware of the planning of it, but the folklore is there from the very beginning.
Who actually did admit responsibility? Remind us.
To use a little bit of modern lingo, I suppose you might say it was dissidents. But this wasn't the first attempt. I mean, the IRA had toyed with the idea of blowing up Nelson in the 30s, for example, but this is ex-IRA members, and that's an important part of the story too.
But it was quite a messy bombing, wasn't it?
It was, in that the top half of the pillar comes crashing down into the street, including Horatio Nelson himself. The bottom half of the monument remains standing. You have this kind of staircase to nowhere. And the Irish Army are brought in a week later for a controlled demolition, which is a huge spectator event. You know, thousands of people gather for this. They're promised a dull thud by the army, and they get this great loud bang.
1966 was the end of Nelson's pillar, but not the end of Nelson. He made a few guest appearances about the place, didn't he?
The travelling head of Nelson was one of the big stories of 1966. It was stolen by students from the National College of Art and Design, and they took it from a corporation lockup, and they began renting it out to anyone who could pay for it. So it ended up on stage with the Dubliners. It was on Killiney Beach in an advertisement for women's stockings in the window of an antique shop in London. And now it's in Pearse Street Public Library. Hopefully its travelling days are over.
The demise of the pillar probably suited the state, and it would have been hard to imagine Nelson staring down on the ceremonies outside the GPO celebrating Ireland's freedom fighters. The closing ceremony took place at the end of Easter week, again with De Valera in a starring role.
16 became his philosophy, if you like, what had been aimed at then in the proclamation. He was prepared to say he lived by, and so on.
So it's really interesting that Eamon De Valera, on one of his last public appearances at the GPO, does propose the affiliation of the northern 6 counties.
Now, I, for one, am never going to believe
that the land of the O'Neills and the O'Cahans, the MacDonalds, the Maguires and the McGuinnesses, that land is going to remain permanently severed from the rest of this country.
It's glossed over. It's quite interesting that he is still using that language of a lost Gaelic Ulster in '66.
You can't really say that's a call to arms or anything like that. You know, it's more a very brief lamentation.
Yet all De Valera's television appearances probably did him no harm in terms of his presidential campaign. Beating his young Fine Gael opponent, Tom O'Higgins, he was elected for a second term later that year.
I'm Sir Eamon De Valera, Ayala Asayarbu.
If that was so, De Valera squeaked home with only 10,000 votes to spare.
He probably wouldn't have made it without that celebration, because he'd been central to all of that. He was the one who took the salute, the army, who regarded themselves as the successors to the volunteers of '16.
Just a few years after 1966, communities on both sides here in Northern Ireland were rocked to their very core. This was to be the beginning of a 30-year conflict, killing more than 3,500 people and casting a dark shadow over the grand display of nationalism which framed the Golden Jubilee.
I mean, there had to be some sort of celebration. The question was whether it had to be as big a show as it was. Of course, what happened in Northern Ireland was symptomatic of what was happening in France and in the United States and all over the world at that period in terms of people, ordinary people, demanding civil rights. So you can't totally put it down to some television programs and some music, but there must have been a connection.
The entire rhetoric, public rhetoric of the Irish state changed between 1966 and 1973. I mean, especially when you had then the arrival into government of people like Liam Cosgrave and Conor Chris O'Brien, Gary Fitzgerald, who wanted to lead us into Europe, but especially wanted to lead us out of darkness. And the darkness being the darkness that we had marched through Enniscorthy to commemorate.
So the whole notion that Irish historical, cultural capital as commemorated or indeed celebrated in '66 was dangerous material, pervaded all public discussion, really until the 90th anniversary, when it was suggested that the Irish state could delicately perhaps commemorate it again.
So what, if any, are the lessons to be learned from 50 years ago?
Northern Ireland exploded only 2 or 3 years after those 1966 celebrations. That says to us, be very careful about the way you celebrate the past.
It wasn't considered ever in 1966, the role of women at all, seriously. I think if it is this time around, that will be a great advantage.
Think in a more all-Ireland dimension. You never quite know how something will be read in years to come. One of my shorthands, if I'm talking about 66 people, is that it was a very partitionist commemoration. It was one that centred very much on the independent Ireland.
Any country will always suit its own purpose, will always have priorities, that we only commemorate the past to suit the present.
There'll be no Nationwide on Bank Holiday Monday. On next Wednesday's programme, we bring you the highlights of the weekend's 1916 commemorative events.
And as Mary mentioned, you can see that episode of Nationwide next Wednesday at 7 here on RTE1. Stay with us now, though, for a trip to the zoo on the way next.